Goedemorgen. Welcome aboard Molly of Myler, a Cornish crabber 26. In this video I'll share my experiences of sailing on the inland waterways of the Netherlands. That country has an enormous number of waterways, but not all of them are navigable by yacht. It's a slightly daunting prospect planning a trip such as this for the first time, and I'll share my experiences of what I learned and where I went, and helped as I was by many local sailors, which made a big difference to the experience.
In the summer of 2024 I sailed Molly from her home base on the Solent to join a large rally of traditional yachts in the Netherlands. I spent a total of 6 weeks away, and prior to this I'd never sailed out of UK waters. This video is a summary of what I learned during my adventure, and I hope these experiences might be helpful for anyone else interested in making a similar trip.
I've put chapter timings in the description so you can find sections of interest easily. I'm by no means an expert, so I welcome comments below. Thank you to my regular viewers who have commented on my previous videos. I do read all the comments, and I will reply if you ask a question. If you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to click like, and if you want to receive notifications when new videos are released, click subscribe too. It costs you nothing and it really helps the channel to grow. Go on. Do it, right now. Thank you. Hartelijk dank for watching.
The Standing Mast Route is a series of connected waterways that allows, as the name suggests, yachts to pass through the varied and beautiful Netherlands waters. This system connects the far south of the country, on its border with Belgium, all the way up to the Frisian Islands in the north. However, it's not just a transit route and provides some lovely sailing in its own right. The waters are sheltered, so no swell, ports are numerous and reasonably priced, and one can experience both large cities and natural spaces in the same trip. Approaching from the west, a popular point of entry to the Standing Mast Route is at Vlissingen, which is what I did. Those crossing the North Sea from Britain might choose the port of IJmuiden and follow the ship canal to Amsterdam. For me, the Netherlands divides into 3 main areas: Zeeland in the south with its wide waters of what used to be estuaries, the Garden of Holland in the centre with its narrow canals crossing fields and joining picturesque cities, and the open seas of the Markermeer and IJsselmeer in the north. I didn't spend long in the north, but enjoyed the contrasting experiences of each of these areas. The maximum draft for the Standing Mast Route is 2.5 metres, and there's usually more than that, so a yacht with this sort of draft can make it all the way through the Standing Mast Route. However, if you want to detour from the main route to visit interesting towns, there's often rather less water, and that requires careful checking before you commit to one of those side canals. I chose to complete my trip as a series of day sails. I was solo for a large part of the time, but did have crew at times, and was also for the most part sailing in company with other boats. My route took me along the Sussex and Kent coasts to Dover, where I crossed the Channel, and then followed the French and Belgian coasts to Vlissingen, overnighting in Newport and Blankenberg in Belgium along the way.
I spent quite a while researching information for this trip, and the paperwork was quite intimidating, but in the event turned out to be pretty straightforward. I prepared a dossier containing the following documentation:
proof of ownership of the boat, evidence of tax (VAT) payment, insurance certificate, international certificate of competence, passports, GHIC or health insurance card, SSR Part 3 certificate, ship's radio licence, and a short-range radio operator's certificate. In the end, though, the only documents demanded were my passport and the SSR certificate. The latter surprised me, as I did not think it was compulsory, and it's not a proof of ownership, but the customs were very happy, and I didn't argue. Since the United Kingdom ceased to be part of the Schengen area of free movement, the logistics for sailors entering and leaving the EU has been a much discussed and much bemoaned topic. I think it's fair to say the situation was quite a mess in the first years, with changing requirements, conflicting advice, and poor availability of information. However, at the time I travelled, arrangements seemed to be normalising. When I was planning this trip, entry into Schengen at a French port seemed unnecessarily bureaucratic and inconvenient for a sailor making passage, not wanting to stay more than one night. In contrast, the arrangements for entering via a Belgian port were clearly explained in English and accessible in advance via a web form, which is why I chose Newport as a port of entry over Calais or Dunkirk. The process of entering and exiting the EU is pretty simple. The UK Border Force has a web system for leisure boats, and it's a simple matter to submit what is called a pleasure craft report to log exit or entry of UK waters. Similarly, I submitted a report to the Belgian authorities online in advance, so when I arrived in Newport they were expecting me. In fact, the Belgian border police were really helpful people. Their offices were right inside the marina and were open quite long hours at Newport. This was very helpful for us because we arrived in the evening and were able to check in early the next day, and this meant we did not waste time waiting to see an official. The inland waterways are very busy in places, catering for both commercial and leisure traffic, large and small. The European Code for navigating the inland waterways is called CEVNI and is compulsory certification in order to use the canals. In the UK, this is achieved using an online CEVNI test after some self-study, which forms an addition to the International Certificate of Competence. This was a bit confusing when I was learning it in my armchair, but it makes sense when you see it in action and is just an extension of the normal buoyage and rules for navigation. Many waterways are peaceful and quiet, whilst others are very busy. Barges are fast and can be very low in the water, so a sharp lookout is needed. In particular, look behind you. Although they usually make surprisingly little wake, busy canal junctions can be very choppy, where the wakes of larger vessels reflect from concrete banks. In these big canals, the banks are often very steep, so a small yacht can travel very close to the edge, which is useful for keeping out of the way of shipping. Many shipping channels in more open water have what is referred to as a cycle lane. This is where there are small craft channels just outside the main shipping channel, indicated by smaller buoys with a white stripe in addition to their red or green colour. My primary navigation tool was Navionics, which I find really good for sea passages. However, it's less useful in the canal system because it's hard to plan routes from Navionics and it doesn't show enough detail for bridges and locks. The IMRE and Cruising Association guides were useful for planning in advance, but whilst I was there I discovered the Standing Mast Route book, which is much more user-friendly when underway and has great maps. However, all the text is in Dutch, so a little advanced translation is needed. I did not know about this book before travelling, and it would have made my planning much easier if I'd had it in advance. Another tool I was shown by the locals is an app called WaterMap Live. This is excellent for planning, has bridge lock instructions in English and shows live information on closures. It's not free, but it's excellent value for money. You need to bear in mind that it uses mobile data, so make sure you download the sections you need in advance, ideally on Wi-Fi. Passing bridges takes some getting used to. You'll need good low-speed boat manoeuvring skills, as you'll often need to hold position for some time. You need to know your own boat and how she handles at close quarters with little way on. Lots of visiting boats try to go in circles while waiting, but there's often too many boats to do this, so the best strategy is to gently turn the nose into the wind whilst you're waiting, unless of course the bridge is downwind of you. The light sequence is red, red-green and green. As you approach, it's tempting to drift up slowly if you can see a red light. However, you need to get up close to the bridge. The operator, who's often monitoring by camera from afar, won't start the opening sequence if a group of boats are spread out and will wait until all the group is very close to the bridge and of course close to each other. It can be a bit frustrating jilling around and seeing a boat slowly approaching in the distance. Many bridges and locks have waiting pontoons, but not all, so you can spend a long time jilling around. In the case of rail bridges, the openings work around the train timetable, so you may have to wait. Other bridges have set opening times and you need to plan in advance for these. As soon as the red-green light shows, move even closer to the bridge. As you're passing through and immediately after, don't slow down, as this causes an obstruction for boats travelling behind you. Some of the bridges have fixed spans as well as opening spans, which means small and medium-sized yachts can pass under without having to wait for an opening. This can be a real time saver. It means that you need to know your air draft though, and also check clearances in advance in the pilot guides. It's worth bearing in mind though that the water level can vary, so be sure to check on the tide gauge if you think it might be tight. There are many locks, sluice in Dutch, and these are used as flood protection and to prevent bodies of water mixing as much as they are for changing level. If you're used to the canal locks in UK inland waterways, then the sluices of the Netherlands are a bit of a surprise at first. My first surprise when entering the canals from the sea at Vlissingen was that the level went down. The Netherlands is not called the Low Countries for nothing. Many sluices are doubled with an enormous ship lock and a smaller sluice for leisure craft. Nevertheless, locks for small craft are often pretty large and at busy times get packed tightly. 20 plus boats is not unusual. People are very friendly and happy to take a line, but there's a quiet competitiveness, and the Dutch don't do queuing. The construction of locks varies considerably. Some have wooden or plastic rubbing strakes, while others are concrete or stone, so it's well to have several spare warps as well as many fenders to hand. I carried fender boards, but never needed to use them. The locks mostly don't change level much, and there's little turbulence, so it's usually easy to hold a small boat in place, useful when you're single-handed. But obviously you need to be ready to feed lines if the level changes, so be careful tying off. I often used a single breast warp amidships and held Molly tight against 2 fenders either side of a cleat, which usually worked well enough. Fenders normally need to be very low and in some cases floating sideways on the water. The cleats can be a little hard to reach, and those in the walls of the sluice are often quite tricky. Warps may need placing with a boat hook. Most of the harbours in the Netherlands are more like clubs than the commercial marinas seen in UK waters. They are plentiful and always seem to have visitor berths, so exact route planning is not always necessary, useful if you're delayed by a bridge or sluice. You will invariably find them cheaper than in the UK. Most visitor berths are alongside mooring, but sometimes you're allocated to a box berth, which can be a test of boat handling and rope work. Make sure you have 4 good warps, including 2 very long ones, and I always accepted offers of help from the shore when offered. People have asked me about toilet waste. Molly is fitted with a holding tank, and since 2009 it's been prohibited to discharge toilet waste into the inland waterways, including canals and the inland seas. This means that if a boat is not fitted with a holding tank, a yacht needs to use a chemical toilet, or you need to go ashore to use the facilities.
All the marinas we stayed in were very friendly, and nearly everyone speaks excellent English. I felt a bit bad speaking in English all the time and would often start a conversation with, "May I speak English?" to which the reply was invariably, "Of course," in a tone which might at first sound sarcastic, but simply reflects the fact that the Dutch switch routinely between French, German, English and their own language.
We carried an inflatable tender and electric outboard, but never used it. I thought we might anchor and row ashore, but we didn't anchor overnight at all. That space in the locker would have been much more usefully employed to carry a couple of folding bikes to explore the surroundings. However, the Netherlands is famously well organised for bikes and they're easy to hire. Many harbours have bikes which visiting sailors can borrow, often for free. This is well worth doing, as the countryside is quite flat and there are plenty of cycle lanes. On the waterways, look out for the plentiful wildlife. There are many artificially created habitats at intervals along the canals, which provide sheltered lagoons and mudflats with a range of fowl, some of which are familiar to UK boaters and others not. Have some binoculars on hand. You'll see and hear coots, cormorants, grebes, storks and even parakeets. If you choose to anchor or moor in the more secluded spots, it's such a pleasure to see and hear the wildlife around the boat. As I said previously, you'll do lots of low-speed manoeuvring, and sailing on small canals is not usually practical, so you need to be confident in your engine. Make sure your engine is properly serviced before you travel, and carry some spares, especially a seawater impeller and drive belts. I did about 180 engine hours on this 6-week trip. The waterways of the Netherlands include some large areas of shallow freshwater, and there are some patches of so-called foutainweed. These can foul your prop or block the engine water intake, so it's easy to damage your impeller. The infected areas change from year to year. We only noticed it on the Markermeer near Hoorn when we travelled.
Molly's reasonably well equipped for a small yacht, but if she carried every piece of safety equipment, I think she would sink. Safety is a matter of considering the most likely emergency situations and balancing that with cost and space. Bear in mind the SOLAS regulations require small yachts to carry certain pieces of equipment. You'll make your own decisions. Here's what I carried.
DSC VHF radio, AIS transducer. I thought it was really important to have a transmitter so that commercial shipping could see me clearly. I upgraded my AIS from a receiver only to a transmitter. There were several occasions on our channel crossings when Molly was hailed directly, and this was very helpful. It's also helpful to see barges which are still round the bend on canals. An AIS transducer is not cheap, but I think it's good value for money. A side benefit is that family and friends were able to track our location online. Radar reflector. I met someone who was fined in the Netherlands for not having a radar reflector. In my view, for a small yacht with AIS, they're of questionable value, but are required kit, so I bought a tubular one and fitted it to one of my shrouds for the duration of the trip. Personal locator beacon. I have a McMurdo Fast Find PLB which I carried in my pocket at all times when offshore or solo. Flares. These are not a UK requirement, so do not have to be carried. I don't want pyrotechnics aboard, so I have an LED flare, which I would use in emergency at night once assistance was close. Fire extinguisher. Again, this is not a requirement, but I was told that if the authorities spot an out-of-date fire extinguisher, then you get a fine. Same goes for flares. I replaced my expired foam fire extinguisher with an automatic engine bay fire extinguisher and a fire blanket for the galley. So what didn't I carry? I didn't have a motoring cone. I wish I did have one of those. I almost never see them used in UK waters, but are a requirement on the inland waterways and could earn you a fine if you motor sail on the busy canals without one. In the event, I just kept my sails furled on the busy canals, but it's often helpful to have some jib out when motoring, so I wished I did have a motoring cone. The other two things I didn't have was a danbuoy or a life raft. I made sure everyone wore life jackets in the cockpit, and I could have rented a life raft, but in the end decided not to.
If you're still watching, thanks for sticking with me, and if you haven't done so already, please take a moment to click like. If you think I've forgotten anything, or if you want to share your experiences, please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. See you next time.